Tu tawa mai I runga, tu tawa mai I raro, tu tawa mai I roto, tu tawa mai I waho. Kia tau ai, te mauri tu, te mauri ora, ki te katoa. Homi e, hui e, tai ki e. Come forth from above, within, and below the environment. Vitality and well-being for all, we are strengthened in unity. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. No mai, haere mai, welcome to our University of Auckland Early Childhood Seminar. The karakia I selected for today attunes us to our important topic, welcoming all children to our place. What does it mean to reduce barriers to inclusion? You are welcome to connect with each other using the chat facility. Please post questions for our presenter in the Q&A facility. I'll hand over now to Justine to introduce our speaker, Professor Jude MacArthur.
Kia ora, Helen. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. I'm delighted to introduce and welcome our speaker today, Dr. Jude MacArthur from Waipapa Taumata Rau, the University of Auckland, where she is a senior lecturer in the School of Critical Studies and Education at the Faculty of Education and Social Work. Jude grew up in Otipoti, Dunedin, and began her career there as a primary school teacher before taking up a lecturing position at the University of Otago in teacher education and inclusive education, working with colleagues across early childhood, primary and secondary sectors. After completing her doctorate, Jude worked as a senior researcher at the Donald Beasley Institute in Dunedin, focusing on disability research and leading national research projects for the Ministry of Education and co-leading our New Zealand Royal Society Marsden-funded research project with Dr. Michael Gaffney from the University of Otago, where they explored the school experiences and identities of children and young people with disabilities as they transitioned from primary to secondary school. Jude has also worked as part of Massey University's specialist teaching team, teaching courses in inclusive education and professional inquiry, and coordinating an endorsement for experienced teachers in education for children and young people with complex educational needs. In 2019, we were fortunate to have Jude join us at Waipapa Taumata Rau in the School of Critical Studies and Education. And she's been teaching and researching in inclusive education, disability policy, and current issues in education. In addition to her academic work, Jude is also a member of the governing committee of the Inclusive Education Action Group, which advocates for change in the education system. The Inclusive Education Action Group promotes knowledge, attitudes, policies, and practices that facilitate inclusive education, so all children, young people, and adults, including those with disabilities, have equal opportunities to learn, belong, and flourish in their local regular educational settings. This ethos aligns with Jude's particular interests in the education experiences of disabled children and young people, and in how early childhood services and schools can be places where all children, young people, and their whānau are welcome, valued, belong, and learn well. As Jude shares with us today, please do use the Q&A function for any questions that arise, and Jude will respond to them at the end of her presentation. Nau mai, haere mai, Jude. We are delighted to have you with us today. Over to you.
Tēnā tātou katoa. Ngā mihi ki koutou katoa. Thank you, Justine, for that introduction. I was sitting here thinking, oh gosh, I've been around a long time, haven't I? Listening to that. So thank you very much for asking me to come along today and talk to you about a subject that is definitely a passion of mine and that I've been sort of immersed in for a long time. And maybe I could just start by noting that my background is in primary teaching, and I always feel a little bit like I'm an imposter in the early childhood education environment, and I have to just say that over the years I have greatly enjoyed the collaborative work that I've done both at Otago University and here at Waipapa Taumata Rau with my early childhood colleagues. I always feel like I've sort of come home when I'm working with early childhood educators. I had 3 children myself, all of whom went through early childhood education, and I did my stints on the governing committees of those centres as well. And I feel very comfortable, I think, in that environment, and particularly with your beautiful curriculum, Te Whāriki. So today, I just want to kind of acknowledge that I am not immersed in your context every day, as those of you who are listening are. And while I work with a lot of students who are in early childhood education, it's not my day-to-day reality. So I am going to share with you today some of the ideas that we share with our students in early childhood education and in the compulsory school sector around inclusive education. And I've chosen to focus a little bit around the NALPs, and I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the NALPs, but these are the National Education and Learning Priorities now that have been set down for early childhood, the compulsory education sector, and for the tertiary education sector in New Zealand. And it's basically sets out the government's priorities for education that will ensure success and well-being for everybody. And so the NALPs are a concern of early childhood educators today. So I just want to frame what I'm talking about around these, and to think about, what do they mean to us as early childhood educators, and what sort of things do we need to be thinking about in relation to our responsibilities in early childhood education to those. So I'll talk a little bit about the NALPs at the start, and then I'm going to move on and just quickly look at the ERO research that was done last year, and also some research by colleagues at Canterbury University who work in the early childhood sector, just to get a bit of a picture of, where are we at the moment? How are we doing out there? What's actually happening for disabled children and their families? And then I just want to finish off by sharing with you some of the thinking that we do with our students now, which focuses on an exploration of what we call discourses. And I'll explain in a little bit what that is all about, but also how discourses can help us to recognise barriers to inclusion, which is what the NALPs actually require us to do, and also to think about how we can move ahead around in terms of developing what we call inclusive pedagogies and practices. So here we have the NALPs, the Statement of National Education and Learning Priorities, and I've put a wobbly yellow circle there around objective 2, but you'll see across the top there are 3 objectives, and the first 3 are of importance to early childhood settings. So you'll see there that covers the objective of learners at the centre. The second objective is barrier-free access, and that's the one that I'm going to be talking about primarily today. And the third one is about quality teaching and leadership. Oops, sorry, beg your pardon. So NALP objective 2, there it is for you. Just thinking about, what might this mean for your centre? Objective 2 is barrier-free access, and there it is described for you there, that children will get a great education opportunities and outcomes, that those will be within reach for every learner. And priority 3, which is about barriers to education, I think is a really interesting one, because if we look at international understandings about inclusive education, identifying barriers to inclusion is considered to be one of the sort of key ways that we can move forward in our teaching practice. So that's why I've decided to sort of focus on that one today. Having said that, I should perhaps make it clear at the outset what my understanding of inclusion is. And I guess I really like to think of it in terms of what one of my colleagues, Roger Slee in Australia, says. and he asks the question, what kind of society do we want our children to grow up and live in, both now and in the future? And if we're thinking about disabled children, you know, that focuses our attention on living in societies that are respectful of diversity, you know, where we expect out there in our communities to have a diverse group of people to really not only recognise but also celebrate that diversity and to respond to it in a positive way. And of course, Roger's comment takes us back to education, because this next question is, what does that mean for our early childhood centres and schools? So if we want an inclusive society, then we need to begin thinking about our early childhood centres and schools as being like microcosms of that society, and they are the places that reflect the values that we hope to see out there in the wider community that include all people. So priority 3 there you can see is about reducing barriers to education for all, including disabled learners, ARCOLA, and those with learning needs. And I just want to very quickly explain that I do use the term disabled children. We can also talk about children with disabilities, but I choose to use disabled as the first word, and the 2 reasons for that. The disability community has quite clearly said that that is a form of positive identity language. So disabled person means, you know, that disability is an integral part of who I am. It's part of my identity. If I didn't have that disability, I would not be me. And that putting the word disability first is a way of recognising the positive status that disability has in my life. And, you know, quite often the point is made, we don't talk about people with gayness or people with fluid gender identities and so on. We talk about, you know, a gay person for the same reason. And so disabled learners, disabled children is the language we choose there. The other reason for doing that is just based on the social model of disability, which again, disabled people designed this idea that just the experience of disability doesn't come from the impairments that you have, rather it comes from living in a society or going to a school or going to an early childhood centre where diversity is not valued, or where we don't understand, you know, we don't respond to the diversity that's in our community. So we're disabled by the society that we live in. So it was a long explanation, but I felt I needed to just clarify that. So the NELP talks about these 2 goals, and you know, I think it's quite good to think about our own centres and to think about, well, if these are goals, how might we go about ensuring that we're sort of working towards these? So we ensure that disabled children and staff, those with learning support needs and neurodiverse learners, are safe, included in their early learning service, and that their needs are supported. And talks there about supporting places of learning to build their capability to identify and understand children's needs and the barriers to their success. Those are the NELPs for you, and just generally the sort of context that I wanted to talk with you about today. I just wanted to start with a question of, you know, kind of a bit of a reflection on where we are at the moment around inclusion in early childhood education. And I just wanted to draw your attention to this piece of work that was done last year by ERO, the Education Review Office. They interviewed literally hundreds of teachers, families in whānau, children and young people, both across early childhood and the compulsory school sectors, and then pulled this research together into 2 publications. And the one that's focused on early childhood is called A Great Start. Now, I have pulled out some of the common themes from that research. And I just wanted to quickly go through them with you today, just to kind of set the scene for, well, where are we at the moment, and what does this suggest in terms of moving forward? And you'll see here, there's some of the barriers that we are talking about today become apparent. So, first of all, disabled children enjoy early childhood education. They feel safe and that they belong. But most parents in whānau believe, and most parents in whānau believe that their child feels loved, cared for and comfortable and have a sense of belonging at their service. So that's sort of the good news part of the research. I'm just going to have a slight drink with I'm losing my voice. Second point, disabled children are being excluded from enrolling and fully participating in early childhood centres. So the research found that a significant number of parents in whānau are being discouraged from enrolling their child and are being asked to keep their child home for specific activities. And that same theme was also found in the school sector. So just a little bit more about that. Almost 1 in 5 parents in whānau had been asked to keep their disabled child at home. And of those parents, over a quarter had been asked to do that in a way that they described as often. Second finding was we don't know how well disabled children are progressing. And the finding there was that a lot of services just lacked information showing how well children were progressing with their learning. And we're not really clearly communicating children's next steps with their whānau. And the finding from that was that discussions with parents in whānau kind of revealed that they knew what their child was doing during the day and what had happened during the day, but they did not have a clear picture of how their child was progressing in terms of their learning. Children with a higher level of disability or complex needs were found to be doing less well than any other child. They were more likely to experience exclusion. And kaiako were less likely to discuss children's learning with their parents in whānau, and whānau were less likely to report that their child feels safe and that they belong. And I just wanted to try to sort of connect this with another finding, which was that kaiako often talked about sort of lacking confidence in themselves in terms of knowing just how to be a teacher for a child who had a high level of complex needs. And some of the ideas I will present to you later on are sort of try to interrogate, why that might be the case. Why might teachers sort of lack confidence in themselves? Why are they lacking their confidence in terms of their knowledge of the curriculum for these children? And the last one there, transition from early childhood to schools were not working as well as entry into ECE. And one of the findings there was that communication with and sharing information between early childhood services and teachers was found to be a real challenge. The need, and families just basically said, the need to re-establish the case for their child's need for support and navigating systems were real challenges for families and for whānau. I just wanted to add to that last point about transition from early childhood to school, and something that has come to our attention just recently from a number of different sources is that there seems to be, and this is anecdotal, but it's come up several times, which kind of makes us wonder what is happening here. And that is that we've heard a number of stories of families being advised by early childhood centres to enrol their child in a special school. And I just think it's interesting that early childhood centres historically are incredibly inclusive, and we're very quick to move into, to move around inclusive education and to establish themselves as places that are inclusive. And I know how highly valued families feel and how much their child feels valued in an early childhood service. And it's quite a challenge for me to sort of think of that transition as being a time where you might move from this lovely inclusive place, which is really truly a part of your community, to, a segregated special school, which pretty much always takes the child out of their home community to another place, another part of the city. But more than that, also takes them from a position of being sort of highly valued in an ordinary education setting to being fully excluded, but also to be then associated with, what we would describe as a different paradigm or different way of thinking about children and their learning, which comes from special education. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Areas that the research found needed strengthening. Here we've got this point about Kayako feeling not confident in teaching disabled children and really struggling to access support to help them, to help children develop. And of course, you look at that, you can say, well, there are probably some connections there, aren't there, between, the lack of support and the difficulties getting hold of support and that sense of just sort of lacking confidence in themselves. They're not easily getting access to those collaborative relationships that can really enhance their own confidence, self-confidence as teachers. Partnerships with whānau and with children needed to be strengthened and more focused on the child's learning, what's happening, what needs to be done in order to enhance learning, not just what have I done today, but actually what have I learned today. And as I said before, transition in and out of school was problematic with, quite poor information sharing at both ends. I just wanted to show you this graph, that connects back to the point I was making about the anecdotal sort of comments that we've been hearing about children going from their local early childhood centre to a special school. This comes from Education Counts, and it does show a 104% increase in the number of children being enrolled in special schools since 1998 to 2021. And I just find this does take into consideration the growth in population. I find it extraordinary that in a country that supposedly has an inclusive education system, that the school system is possibly proving not to be totally inclusive in the sense that more children are now going into segregated placement, despite the fact that we know that outcomes for children in those settings are not nearly as good as they are for children in their local schools. Alex Gunn is an early childhood educator from the University of Otago, and some of Alex's work with her colleagues talks about some of the elements in inclusive education, and particularly focused around the voices of children and families. And, she's made the point here, and this sort of harking back to what the ERO researchers showed. She's harking back to some themes that might help us to understand what might be happening here. And so she's made the point that, listening to the voices and experiences of marginalised groups and hearing what those groups have to say and to see what they experience is something that's really important for us as educators. To actually see the issues here as about being the rights of all children and families and adults to participate in educational environments, where we actually assume diversity is a real thing. It's going to happen. It's going to be in our classrooms. It's going to be in our early childhood centres. And that rather than seeing this as a problem, we actually view this as a rich resource. And she talks there about, everyone who participates should experience that sense of belonging. And that's an idea that now we connect very much with the idea of inclusion is, yes, learning is absolutely central. And the other part of inclusion is that sense of belonging, that I belong here in this place. It's a place where I know that I'm respected and valued for who I am and for my strengths and my interests and for what I can contribute. So I just wanted to kind of wrap this little bit here up with a return to Te Whāriki, which I just see as an incredible resource. It is a central policy which is just so full of possibilities, and that I think it's really good for us to keep going back to the words and the ideas in Te Whāriki, and to think about how they can support us to continue to keep doing better around this whole area of inclusion. And just the description there of inclusive practice and the key ideas, just really central. And I think in terms of reflecting on where we are and where we're going, just coming back to some of these is really important. And you'll see there, that reference to all children's right to access the depth and breadth of the curriculum. It's really clear about that. We're talking about rights here. Providing a fully inclusive service is about, enriching the environment, and, the sociocultural foundations of Te Whāriki here are just really important in that regard. That sense of creating a community culture that ensures that everybody is actively involved in meaningful play and learning and so on, connecting back to that idea of, what sort of society do we want to live in? How do we draw on those ideas that come all the way from Dewey's work, really, about, the centre as that microcosm of the community. This is the place where the relationships are established between children, the rich relationships that underpin what we know as quality teaching and learning and so on. And that last point there, bringing us back to what's the teacher's role, it is understanding how everybody learns, and kind of picking up on that idea that comes from our understanding now about neurodiversity, for example, that we've got that diversity in our centres. That's a richness and a resource that we can work with. And I think it's great, like Te Whāriki has established these ideas a long time ago. So I just wanted to shift on to just look at discourses that we talk. Well, we use the idea of discourse with our students, and I really just wanted to just quickly introduce it to you tonight. We teach whole courses on this stuff, so this is a real quick fire kind of invitation to think about something that might be a little bit different. Discourses get us to think about our beliefs and our values and our assumptions and our practices. And, you'll see there that the NELP kind of gets us to focus on those. And Alex Gunn's work also gets us to think about, well, and even in relation to the NELPs there, we can be thinking about taking steps to reduce and eliminate barriers, but we have to know where the barriers are, and then we have to know what do we do about those barriers. And, thinking about our beliefs, how we understand children, how we understand diversity in our centres, what are our values here, what are our assumptions and practices around who does what with whom and so on, that all of those things involve working towards dismantling any values or assumptions and practices that might keep those barriers, that might sustain those barriers, sorry. So when we talk about discourses, this is what we're talking about here. It's a powerful mix of values, attitudes, beliefs, and practices. And taken together, we call those a discourse. You can hear a discourse in the language that's used in a centre or a school. You can see a discourse in practice. And depending on what it is that's going on in the school, you can see a discourse of inclusion when that's happening, when all children are working really well together as a group, where teachers and ESWs and so on have got very clear roles and responsibilities, working with all children to support that learning community. Equally, we get our students to think about a discourse of deficit. And again, even if you take the question of how do teachers and ESWs work together, we can see a discourse of deviance or a deficit discourse in action if a child is often or constantly attached to an ESW, or in a classroom always attached to a teacher aide, or in a situation where a centre might advise a family to enrol their child in a special school. So we can think about the thinking that's going on behind those practices and think about them in terms of what is the discourse that's going on here. So some mixes make up what we would call a discourse of inclusion. Some mixes of values, attitudes, beliefs, and practices make up what we call a discourse of exclusion. And I've just given you some very quick examples there. But hopefully that idea of the different discourses and the connections between values, attitudes, beliefs, and practices might make some sense to you. And we might start to critique, examples of exclusion through this idea of discourse. I just wanted to refer you to that because the Te Whāriki online resource is a wonderful place to go in and start thinking about what these discourses might be and what they might look like in practice. And one of the thinking points here that's raised in this resource is the point that how you view a child determines your actions. So I just want to play around with that idea. How do we think of disabled children? And how do our thoughts then translate into the actions in the centre? And I'm going to do this just by illustrating to you something from Bernadette McCartney, who is an early childhood teacher herself, from her PhD research, which was done a wee while ago now. It was in the sort of early, well, there you can see 2009. I wondered about whether to show you this or not, and I decided in the end to do it because it's such a good example of two different discourses in practice. So I'm going to read these out to you, and I hope that we would not ever see something like this happening now. But I also want to kind of invite you to think about what might be some parallels, in terms of our own practice here. So what are the discourses? So this is Bernadette's diary from when her daughter Maggie Rose was just a little baby. On the left-hand side, there is a paediatrician's description of Maggie Rose, one discourse. On the other side is Bernadette and Tony, mum and dad's description of her. I'm just going to read that out to you. So the paediatrician. Thank you for referring Maggie, who is delayed with her development and is of short stature as well. Maggie was a floppy baby, and she was also jaundiced, slow to suck and establish breastfeeding, which did not really get going until she was 3 to 4 weeks old. After that, weight gains have been steady and have taken off recently with a marked increase in weight, so that now Maggie is quite obese. This is accentuated by her short limbs and short length. Bernadette's description. The paediatrician was quite concerned after meeting and examining Maggie Rose, and she will be having tests soon to x-ray her skeleton, scan her brain, and check out her chromosomes. Apparently her limbs are disproportionately short, and as a whole, she is very short for her age. Of course, she is still our lovely wee Maggie Rose. We will start checking our early intervention services for her and have been talking to family and friends about her having some disabilities. She may have an intellectual impairment of some sort too, because her social, motor, and intellectual development are delayed. She'll certainly get every opportunity to reach her potential and is a motivated wee possum. So on the left is the early interventions teacher's description, and on the right, again, Bernadette and Tony's reflections. The early intervention teacher. She did not smile until 9 weeks old, and this was only occasional. More smiles came at 12 weeks of age, but she has been slow in her social development, not interacting with other people and not showing a great deal of eye regard, even to her parents. She's not able to hold her head up when prone, and she's certainly not sitting. She does not support her weight when held upright. Maggie shows significant delay in development, motor, social, and cognitive. She is short. She needs further investigation. Bernadette. Maggie's turning into a rough and tumble girl. She loves flying up in the air, being bounced, loves music, and Tony playing the guitar. She stops whatever she's doing, eyes wide open, and she listens. Maggie is enjoying making silly noises like frog sounds and other animal sounds, the ones that tickle her fancy each day, and when you hit the spot, she giggles, saying mum a lot in the last few days, talks to us and to herself. We talked in our interview with Amanda about the question marks that arose over Maggie's development and her future. And so I just sort of encourage you to sort of think about those questions there that I've popped up, and that is, what are the discourses that you can hear here, and how would you describe them? And if you were a teacher and you listened to those two different stories, how might that impact on your practice, on your assumptions about Maggie Rose, about her capability, your understanding of her capability, and what you will then do as a teacher? And I just wanted to go back to an idea which one of my own lecturers from the University of Otago way back, Keith Ballard, who was a very early writer in the area of inclusive education, when he talks about the power of ideas, about who is valued, who belongs, and who decides. And he's made this comment that if we hold on to the idea that disability is an abnormality or illness, I think we could hear that in the discourse of the paediatrician and the early intervention teacher, then what happens is there's an impact on our practice. We then begin to practice the separate and curative strategies of special education. And I'm just going back to the point that I made earlier about some disabled children leaving early childhood centres to go to segregated special education settings, and to sort of think about what is the discourse that we're buying into and suggesting to families that that might be the best way ahead, particularly when we've hopefully been working from a discourse of inclusion in our own setting and centre. Keith just talks about how some ideas hold greater power for influence than others. Special education is a widely accepted, powerful and sustainable idea with well-resourced practices that pervade our education system. Inclusion, by contrast, is an idea that struggles to gain understanding and acceptance. And I think to a certain extent, we still see that today. And if we look at segregated education, particularly, very well resourced around therapies and so on, compared with children when they move from early childhood to school. Families pretty much know that accessing therapies like, physiotherapy, speech language therapy is going to be quite a challenge. And again, I just want to remind you of what are the discourses that are in action here, both in the policies, both in what families find and experience when they make that transition. Bernadette and my colleague Massey Morton have also talked about, coming back to this point of reminding ourselves, how are we actually thinking about the child? Are we thinking about the disabled child as passive and the other, which I think we could see there in that description of Maggie Rose by the paediatrician? Or are we thinking in terms of their capacities, their interests, their status as learners, and the commonalities that they have with non-disabled children in our centres? And it's not unusual still to see that discourse of deviance in practice, and we may find it in some early childhood settings, and we may find it in some schools, that the child is seen as the problem, which needs to be fixed. So coming from that normative way of thinking, as opposed to thinking diversity and difference is a positive asset in our centre. And if we come from that perspective of the child as problem and as a needing fixing, then they are automatically cast as the other, rather than being seen as a competent and capable learner. I have popped a little article, a reference to an article by Kate McAnally and Michael Gaffney on the end of the resources there. This is a lovely piece of research that came out of Kate's PhD research, where she described the experiences of a little disabled boy in early childhood education. And she talked about these 4 key elements that really made the centre inclusive. So she described Tama's identity as a learner as being totally recognised and responded to. And rather than having this notion of special needs, this centre talked about his rights as a learner, as a child who both gave and received care. The point about, the second point there, just the view of, they talked about a pedagogy for participation, and it was based on a view of Tama as capable, as actively participating member of his early childhood community. Contribution and belonging there, just the linking of the strands for children's learning within Te Whāriki and the opportunities that he had to make a contribution and to participate fully in the day-to-day activities of the centre. So there's no example of micro-exclusion going on there. But I really love this idea that Kate has here of the environment playing a key role, that it is the people, the objects, and the practices and the way they all come together to form places that support learning. And she said, we know Tama really enjoys taking the time for the wee things, like appreciating flowers and smelling them. That makes him happy. So it was a comment from one of the teachers. So the environment there established as a very critical and important third teacher for Tama. I'm just looking at the time and it's time to stop. And I'm miles away from finishing. So I'm going to just move very quickly forward now to just the last part of this presentation. I just wanted to draw your attention here to the question of how and where we might see discourses in early childhood practice. This does come from Te Whāriki, and I've highlighted there the yellow in yellow. We might also think about discourse there and what's actually happening there in terms of the language. What is the discourse that we're using when we're referring to some children who require additional support? And that we could actually reframe that to think of all children as requiring support, and think of support as being where our focus is rather than on labelling the child. So support is a resource out there that's available to everybody, and potentially could be used by anybody in the centre, rather than using support to label the child. I'm going to flick over this, unfortunately, but there is a nice little video there which shows how this family, this Māori family, were devastated when their child was diagnosed with autism, because from a Western perspective, the focus was on deficits and lack of capability. And it was this family's engagement with the idea of takiwātanga, which is the Māori word for autism, in one's own time and space, that really opened up a new way of thinking about their little boy and about his capability. And it was just a lovely example of two discourses in discourses in action. A discourse, deficit discourse, being challenged by a discourse informed by a tauranga Māori. So I'm just going to finish by just introducing you very quickly to a way of thinking which gets students in our courses to make this shift from focusing on a disabled student as being a student who requires additional learning support, or a student who needs help, and so on, to reframe our thinking around, what can we do in our centres that benefits everybody? And it's using an approach which is based on this idea of inclusive pedagogies. And it really does involve shifting the focus of our thinking. So rather than thinking, what's wrong with this child, and thinking about barriers to learning in that way, the shift is to what's wrong with our context, what needs to change in our own context, what needs to change in the curriculum and our pedagogy and the environment and other external factors that are within our power to change. And this is where I come back to that idea of teacher confidence here. We do use universal design for learning. And the idea of universal design for learning is that we start with everybody in mind from the outset. We start thinking in terms of diversity as an ordinary thing in our centre. It's a rich resource that we have to work with. Universal design really encourages us to try and identify possible barriers to learning and the solutions that can be offered for every child. And it makes us think about these things here, barriers to learning. Where can we find them in our thinking, how we think about children, how we think about their rights, their educability? It can be in the design of the learning experience itself. It could be in the materials and resources we use or the methods we use. It could be in the way we assess children's learning, which gets back to that ERO finding, that parents knew what their children did during the day, but they did not have a good understanding of what their child was learning. And they could be found in the physical, social, and emotional environment of the centre itself. This whole idea is built around this notion of transformability, which is getting teachers to understand that what I do today will make a difference for that child. So in other words, children's capacity to learn can change, and it can be changed for the better as a result of what I do here now in the present. And again, connecting back with that idea of teacher confidence in their knowledge of te whāriki, and their knowledge of teaching practice, which is based on sociocultural theory and on critical pedagogies and so on. Absolutely, totally relevant. I'm just going to refer to that. There are some fantastic reflective and evaluative questions on te whāriki online. And I think there's some great opportunities here for centres to be able to sort of address the NELPs against some of those reflective questions. Just think about those questions there. How are all children provided with opportunities to access the full breadth of our curriculum? And how do we celebrate difference here? To what extent is everyone made to feel welcome and respected? And how do we know that? So that's it, Justine. I'm going to stop there. And I'm sorry, I haven't left an awful lot of time for questions. So I'll stop the share.
Jude, that was fantastic. And we have lots of questions. But I think that people would also have been very happy to have heard a lot more from you, because what you've been sharing is so important. And I think we just don't get enough conversation around this really important topic. But I would just like to acknowledge now, I know you did say that you feel like a bit of an imposter in the early childhood space, but you certainly don't feel like one to me. You feel like an amazing advocate, and I really appreciate the way that you have woven te whāriki throughout this presentation and pointed people to those resources that already exist, that they can go and access and learn more about this really important topic of inclusion and how we can be presenting diversity as ordinary and helping people to shift their thinking. So Rachel would just like to see the references slide again while we're chatting. But I do have a number of questions that have come through, and so we might start with a fairly big one from someone that you have actually mentioned in your presentation. So Alex Gunn is actually here with us today, and Alex has said, can you give us a sense of what inherent risks you see in the notion of progress and teachers' understandings of how children are progressing that seems to have captured the Education Review Office and Ministry of Education thinking? Their construct being imbued with normative thinking about rate and type of progress to be made, what constitutes an acceptable kind of progress? Do you have any comment that might help us think through the idea of progress in a different way?
Yeah. Well, Alex, I don't even know that I can answer that question, and I suspect you're an even better person to answer it. But it is something that is of great interest to me, because I'm actually part of the Inclusive and Bicultural Working Group on the Refresh New Zealand curriculum at the moment, Te Mātea Aho. And so we've been talking a lot in there about how do you measure children's learning, and how do you celebrate their successes, their multiple ways of being successful, and progressions are being built into the curriculum. And I do worry about worry a lot, I think, about our ability to really capture children's learning well in a way that recognises all of the different ways that children learn and the multiple ways that children can be successful. And I know, you know, for example, around the work we're doing in the area of neurodiversity now, we know we've got that idea of spiky profiles. For example, you can be really outstanding in one thing and just really struggle with something else. And that can happen across a year, but it can also happen from day to day. And so our assessment processes need to be able to understand and reflect that, you know, the irregularities in children's learning. So I can only say that I agree with you that it is a concern. I know that, you know, I mean, we've done a bit of work recently with narrative assessment in secondary schools, and that has been incredibly successful in terms of quite really radically turning secondary school teachers' thinking around in terms of student capability. So narrative approaches that allow both, you know, aspects of learning, belonging, the key competencies and so on to all be celebrated, you know, through the assessment process. But I don't know if I've answered your question other than to say it's a really good question. It's an important question, and I think we do know about alternatives, but some of us need to get our heads together and start talking very quickly about that.
Absolutely. And I think linking into that, there've been other questions that people have been asking around, particularly that transition to school. And as you were talking about, often that deficit discourse comes to the fore around transition to school time, because parents, children are suddenly put into that deficit light in order to get support put in place for when they make that transition into school, and also that narrative that seems to be becoming more strong about children needing to go into specialist or segregated educational settings. So thinking about that, what is it that we need to be thinking about in terms of how we are supporting parents to make decisions about where children transition to? How do we help with those transitions? And so Pauline Bishop has actually asked, you know, are we offering things like delaying starting school to children in whānau? Yeah, how can we better position and support that transition?
Yeah, I mean, I've only just kind of touched on so many themes that are relevant to that question. I mean, Alex mentioned normative thinking and, you know, deficit thinking. Why do children go to school? That children don't go to school to get therapy. And, you know, maybe there does need to be some, you know, some critical thinking going on in the early childhood sector around the really deep-seated normative ideas that feed into special education and special education thinking and segregated education. So, you know, we know that segregated education is not good for kids. And it comes back to that whole point at the start that I made, you know, Roger Slee's point, what kind of society do we want to live in? We want children to grow up and live in an inclusive society where their differences, where diversity and difference is valued and understood and respected. And we know that there are great schools out there doing really good work in this area, you know, who have taken pretty solid inclusive education policy from the Ministry of Education and put it into practice in a really good way. And we also know that those schools are not necessarily schools that have got a lot of resources. In fact, the ERO research showed that, you know, schools where there is a wide range in terms of diversity, in terms of ethnicity, culture, and so on, are the schools that were often doing the best around inclusion. So it comes back to that, what is the thinking, what is the discourse that sits behind the practice here? Those schools simply had, you know, a clear focus on the idea that we represent our school community. You live in our school community, you come here and you will be valued and taught well. So, yeah. I guess, the opposite of that is normative thinking and the purpose of education. And I think these are all conversations that early childhood educators can be having in their centres. And it's not just about how do we create this place as an inclusive place for children and families, but how do we ensure that what we do here feeds into that child's transition into a really good school experience so that they stay there.
Yeah, and I think going back a bit, and I probably should have reordered these questions, is thinking about how then do we create our early childhood settings as places where inclusion is practiced. And some of the comments have been around things like, often everyone is inclusive until it gets inconvenient. And that happens in early childhood settings as well as in school settings. And we also know that some early childhood settings are kind of known to be inclusive, and they become those magnet spaces because children and families know that they will be welcomed and have that sense of belonging. Yeah, so, and you did identify kind of 4 key things that some of those centres are doing. So maybe you could just, if you could just talk a little bit more about those things that we can do that would really reinforce, I guess, and maybe give teachers a little bit more kayak or that bit more confidence that they can actually do this. They don't have to outsource it to someone else.
Well, I popped a couple of articles into the resource list, and one was Kate McAnally's work with Michael Gaffney, but also the work that Justine, that I don't want to blow our own trumpets, but Sheehan's research, which you and I supervised, which is a lovely description of an inclusive early childhood centre. I mean, you can read that and you can see in there what it is that made that place such a beautiful place for children and families to be. But your question kind of does remind me of around inclusive pedagogies, which comes from the work of Lani Florian in Scotland and Martin Rouse. They have this really nice idea that they use with their students in initial teacher education. And that is that, when things do go wrong or when there are difficult things that happen, rather than, we can take a deficit view and say that child is too difficult. It's too hard. We don't have the resources. We don't know what to do. I mean, you can do that. And I do wonder could that be some of the thinking that goes on behind the practice that Eero identified of, don't come to the centre, or please don't enrol here, or go down the road, or don't come tomorrow because we're doing this and it's not going to work. So that's placing the blame, if you like, on the child. The problem is located in the child. The child is broken. They need to be fixed, and we just don't know how to do that. There's a bit of a black and white description. But so Lani Florian would say we take that idea, and instead of doing the blame the child thing, let's look at our own pedagogy and practice. Let's make that the problem, and let's treat this as a dilemma that we can work through as teachers. Because that process of working through that problem and trying to figure out what's happening and how can we change this situation is going to make us better teachers for everybody and enhance our own sense of capability, and our own knowledge and capacity to work. And I'm not saying that you should do that necessarily on your own. Sometimes that's going to involve collaboration with others who might know some stuff that we don't know. That's then a resource issue and a time issue.
Yeah. And we are running out of time for the questions, but and I think one thing that I would also point people to thinking more about and doing a little bit more exploration of is something you touched on, which is universal design for learning. That idea that we set the environment and everything up right from the start to be inclusive of everybody, rather than constantly trying to adjust it for the children that are perceived to be broken.
Yes, designing with everybody in mind from the outset, rather than thinking, I'm going to do this for most kids and there's something different for the child with a disability. So it's to break that down and to see that as leading to micro exclusion, and instead think, how do we design this experience for everybody from the outset? And how do we take what we know and do for everybody and extend that to make sure everyone is included?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jude. Kia ora, mō te kōrero. Thank you very much for your contribution to the seminar series and for your ongoing advocacy for inclusion in Aotearoa. Your sharing today has given us all a great deal to think about, to discuss, and I think to also action. So ngā mihi nui ki a koe, and I'm going to hand back to Helen now to close our webinar.
Tēnā koe, Justine, and ngā mihi nui, Jude. For sure, thank you for your contribution. As Justine said, you've given us so much to rethink and reflect on in relation to our assumptions, our languaging, and our practices about reducing barriers to inclusion to enable all children to live in respectful and diverse societies, to pick up on your wording. A reminder to all our seminar participants that a recording of this seminar will be available in a few days on our YouTube channel for you to revisit and to share and discuss with colleagues and families. This has been a seminar where there has already been much discussion, and we can foresee much more to come. We look forward also to seeing you all again in our next seminar. That will be held at lunchtime to accommodate the time zone of our speaker from the USA. So look out for our flyer in your email inbox in the very near future. And I'll just finish with a karakia. Te aroha, te rangi Mārie, me te mana ākitanga o te whānau. Kia ora tātou katoa. Noho ora mai.